The valley's wealthiest mayor was freezing to death in a sub-zero blizzard, slamming his frostbitten hands against a cabin door and begging to enter the very stone ditch he had spent 3 months calling a madman's grave. Standing inside his quiet 65-degree room with a rifle in his hands, the widower didn't open the door right away. Because 3 months ago, when he dragged hundreds of tons of river boulders to build strange V-shaped wind chutes around his house, the entire town swore he had lost his mind. 3 months before the cold front locked the Black Ridge Valley of Wyoming territory under 3 feet of solid ice, September 1882 was drawing to a serene, crisp close. Across the basin, the homesteaders were engaged in the frantic, familiar rhythm of autumn survival. Axe blades echoed through the stands of yellow aspen. Heavy freight wagons groaned under the weight of freshly felled lodgepole pine, stacked 6 feet deep against log walls to deaden the coming frost. Cellars were packed with salted beef, squash, and potatoes. In a high-altitude territory where winter held the land in a vice for half the year, wasting a single sunlit hour was considered a dangerous form of foolishness. Yet on an exposed bench of land at the mouth of Black Ridge Gorge, 42-year-old Thomas Vance was spending his days doing something that left every rancher in the basin shaking his head. Thomas was a widower, having lost his wife Sarah to prairie fever 2 years earlier. For 15 years before settling in Wyoming, he had worked as a chief geological surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad, mapping mountain passes, avalanche paths, and wind shear corridors through the granite peaks of the Continental Divide. He understood stone, and he understood the movement of air better than any man in the territory. He lived in a modest 2-room timber cabin with his 10-year-old son Caleb and Rusty, an old copper-coated Irish setter whose coat matched the autumn grass. The cabin was well built, constructed from hand-hewn fir, but it sat directly in the narrow mouth of the gorge where the terrible Arctic gales descended from the high wilderness without a single hill to break their force. Instead of felling trees to build wooden snow fences like his neighbors, Thomas spent his mornings working with a brass surveyor's transit level mounted on a tall ash tripod. His 10-year-old son Caleb walked 50 paces ahead through the sagebrush, holding a painted wooden measuring rod perpendicular to the wind coming down from the gorge. Caleb was a sharp, observant boy who had learned to read topographical charts before he learned to read Latin. While Thomas sighted through the brass telescope, adjusting the fine thumbscrews, Rusty trotted between them, his dark copper ears twitching at the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure whistling through the rocks. Once the sightlines were marked with pine stakes, the real labor began. Using a heavy wooden stone boat pulled by his pair of draft oxen, Thomas began hauling hundreds of tons of massive granite boulders from the dry bed of Black Creek. He laid the rocks in 2 thick, angled deflector ridges that stretched outward from the northern corners of his cabin at a precise 45-degree angle, forming a prominent V-shape facing straight into the mouth of the gorge. Between the double rows of granite boulders, Thomas tightly packed dense, resinous branches of wild juniper brush, weaving them together with iron wire until the deflector walls rose 6 feet high, tapering into narrow, stone-lined channels at the far ends. To anyone passing on the valley road, it looked like a man digging his own moat or building a chaotic rock maze that served no logical purpose. By mid-October, the construction was the main topic of conversation at the sawmill, the blacksmith shop, and the general store in town. One bright, frosty afternoon, Mayor Ephraim Sterling stopped his polished 2-horse carriage along Thomas's fence line. Sterling was 56 years old, a wealthy lumber baron who owned the local sawmills and held the deeds to half the timber tracts in the county. Sterling had just finished building his own home on a high knoll overlooking town, a sprawling 3-story mansion constructed from thick oak timbers, reinforced with custom iron cross-bracing and boasting 4 massive brick chimneys. Sterling leaned over the side of his carriage, resting his gloved hands on a nickel-plated cane, a condescending smile playing beneath his thick gray mustache. "You're wasting valuable growing weather, Thomas," Sterling called out, his booming voice carrying across the rocky field. "If you want to keep that boy from freezing when the Arctic storms hit, you ought to be buying pine planking from my mill. That pile of river rocks won't stop a Wyoming gale. All you're doing is digging a stone ditch to catch the first drift and bury your cabin alive." Thomas did not stop his work. He was using a heavy iron crowbar to seat a 600-pound granite boulder into the apex of the western deflector wall. His hands were calloused, his flannel shirt damp with sweat despite the chilly breeze, but his dark eyes remained calm as he glanced up at the mayor. "A flat wall tries to fight the wind, Mr. Sterling," Thomas replied quietly, his voice steady and low. "When you fight a mountain wind with a flat wall, the wind always wins. I'm not trying to block it." Sterling let out a loud, theatrical laugh that caused his carriage horses to flick their ears. "Not trying to block it? It's a blizzard, man. You either block it or it freezes you to bone. Wood and iron keep out a winter storm, not a ditch full of rocks and weeds." He shook his head, gathered his leather reins, and added, "You're digging your own grave, Vance. Don't come looking for credit at my mill when the ice settles in." Before the dust from Sterling's carriage had cleared, another rider pulled his horse to a halt near the rock wall. It was Jedediah Stone, a 45-year-old veteran trapper who had spent 20 winters in the high country. Jedediah was a man who trusted tradition above all else. He looked at the 45-degree stone chutes, then at the modest cabin sitting in the apex behind them, and shook his head in disapproval. "Sterling's a blowhard, Thomas," Jedediah said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "But he ain't entirely wrong about this. I've seen drifts 30 feet high in the wind gaps up north. Snow needs a flat fence to settle against. These angled stone troughs you're building will just funnel the wind right down your neck and blow your roof straight into the valley." Thomas wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and motioned toward the mouth of the gorge. "Look at the rock formations at the canyon mouth, Jedediah. See how the granite spurs split the air? The wind doesn't blow straight. It compresses when it hits a narrow gap. If you give it an angled channel, it accelerates. A fast wind carries its snow right over a low target. Nobody drives the wind by standing in front of it. You drive it by giving it somewhere else to go." Jedediah spat again, looking thoroughly unconvinced. "Nobody drives the mountain wind, Thomas. It goes where it pleases, and it takes what it wants." He rode away, leaving the widower and his son alone in the gathering shadow of the mountain. Thomas turned back to his transit level, checked the sightline once more, and tightened the locking screw. He knew the town thought he was mad, but he also knew that nature operated on laws of physics and fluid dynamics that paid no attention to human opinion, timber merchant claims, or traditional mountain lore. October deepened across the Wyoming hills, bringing bitter night frosts that turned the high pasture crisp and white before sunrise. While the rest of the basin watched the gathering clouds with growing apprehension, Thomas Vance continued his quiet, methodical work at the mouth of the gorge. Sitting beside the hearth in the evenings, Thomas used a small pine twig and the smoke from a tallow candle to show his son how wind truly behaved. "When wind hits a flat wall, Caleb," Thomas explained, holding a piece of flat cedar shingle in the thin smoke, "the air stops dead, compresses, and builds up a heavy wall of static pressure. That pressure has to go somewhere. It bursts upward, tearing at the roof eaves, and it rolls downward, scooping up snow and piling it high against the door. That is aerodynamic drag. But if you give the wind a narrowing channel angled at 45 degrees, you trigger the Venturi effect." He moved 2 angled pieces of wood toward the candle flame. The smoke squeezed through the gap, accelerating in a smooth, rapid stream. "The air squeezes, gains speed, and shoots past the sides of the house," Thomas continued, his gray eyes shining with the quiet passion of a man who understood physical laws. "And because the wind is moving so fast on either side, it creates a low-pressure vacuum directly over our roof, a dead air zone. Inside that zone, the air stays still, no matter how hard the storm rages outside." Caleb nodded, his small hands sketching the angled lines onto his slate. "The wind carries its own snow away." "Exactly," Thomas smiled, patting the boy's shoulder. "We don't fight the storm with muscle. We let the storm's own energy carry the cold past us." While Thomas worked on his physics, Mayor Ephraim Sterling's resentment was turning into action. The sight of Thomas's rock chutes had become a source of irritation for the mayor. Neighbors passing on the road were asking questions, and Sterling could not tolerate a poor widower demonstrating an alternative to buying his expensive pine lumber. Furthermore, Sterling was building a new timber storage barn near the river and needed heavy foundation stones before the ground froze solid. Late on a moonless Tuesday night in late October, Sterling sent 2 of his heaviest sawmill hands up the valley with a stout wooden freight wagon and iron pry bars. Their instructions were simple: tear down the apex of Thomas's western stone chute, haul the heavy granite boulders away for the mill foundation, and leave the widower's property looking like a ruined, useless pile of rubble. The men reached the northern edge of Thomas's land under the cover of pitch darkness. They slipped quietly up to the main V-shaped chute where two massive 800-pound granite boulders rested at the key structural pivot. Unbeknownst to Sterling's men, Thomas had not simply piled the rocks on top of one another. Drawing on his years of railroad masonry, he had constructed the deflector walls using interlocking cantilevered friction angles. The boulders were stacked in a locked arch, where the weight of each stone held the others in a state of high structural tension. The two mill hands jammed their heavy iron pry bars beneath the anchor stone at the base of the chute, leaning their full weight against the iron. "Heave," one whispered in the dark. Inside the cabin, Rusty's head shot up from his rag rug. The Irish setter let out a low, vibration-filled growl from deep within his throat. Thomas was awake instantly. He reached for his double-barrel shotgun resting beside the bed and slipped silently toward the window. Outside, the mill hands shoved their pry bars deeper under the anchor stone. With a sharp metallic groan, the key boulder shifted 2 inches out of alignment. That 2-inch shift broke the locked tension of the cantilevered arch. With a sudden grinding roar that sounded like an avalanche cascading down a cliff face, 15 tons of granite river boulders collapsed inward all at once. The massive rocks rolled down the 45-degree incline, crashing directly into the sawmill wagon parked below. The heavy oak wagon wheels shattered into splinters under the crushing weight. The rear axle snapped with a sound like a cannon shot, sending iron fittings flying through the night air. One of the mill hands was knocked flat into the dirt by a tumbling stone, while the second scrambled backward in sheer terror, his pry bar crushed flat beneath an 800-pound boulder. "Run!" the downed man screamed, scrambling to his feet on a twisted ankle. "The crazy bastard rigged the rocks to blow!" Leaving their crushed wagon and scattered tools behind, the two men fled down the road into the darkness as fast as their boots could carry them, convinced the widower had used railroad dynamite to trap his stone wall. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, holding his shotgun and a lantern. The yellow light revealed the wrecked wagon half buried beneath a mound of fallen granite. Rusty trotted forward, sniffing the broken oak wheels and letting out a short, satisfied bark. Caleb walked out beside his father, his eyes wide. "Did they break the chute, Papa?" Thomas walked up to the fallen wall, examining the displacement. "They tried to," he said quietly, picking up a dropped iron pry bar from the dirt. "But they didn't understand how the stones were locked." The next morning offered a sober realization. Though the saboteurs had been repelled, the collapse of the western apex had altered the precise geometry Thomas needed. As dawn broke, Rusty paced back and forth along the western chute, whining softly and pressing his copper nose into the morning air current coming down from the gorge. Thomas set up his brass transit level on its tripod and sighted down the western deflector line. His brow furrowed. The ground settling beneath the crushed wagon had altered the exit angle of the western chute by 3 degrees. To an untrained eye, 3 degrees was invisible. But to a surveyor, 3 degrees meant the difference between a smooth Venturi acceleration and a chaotic backdraft that would bounce off the gorge wall and slam cold air straight down the cabin's chimney. "We have to rebuild it, Caleb," Thomas said, setting his transit down. "Every stone has to be reset." For 48 grueling hours, working through freezing rain and biting mountain winds, Thomas and his son labored to clear the wrecked wagon frame, haul the boulders back into position with their oxen, and relock the cantilevered stone arch. Caleb held the measuring rod with frozen fingers, calling out the angles while his father used heavy timber levers to seat each boulder into its precise 45-degree slot. They rewove the dense juniper brush between the stones, binding the branches tight with fresh wire until the V-shaped chute stood whole once more, sharp, clean, and perfectly aligned with the northern throat of Black Ridge Gorge. When the last stone was placed on the 1st of November, Thomas stepped back and looked up at the mountains. The high peaks were gone, swallowed beneath a vast, motionless sheet of slate-gray cloud. The wind had died completely. The air carried that strange, heavy, metallic scent that old mountain men knew all too well. The test was no longer a matter of calculations or arguments. The sky was preparing to deliver its verdict. The first week of December 1882 arrived with a stillness so profound that it felt unnatural to every living creature in the basin. The wind did not merely ease away, it vanished entirely. The air turned dead, cold and heavy as lead, holding a strange metallic smell that caused the cattle in the lower fields to huddle together in silent, terrified clusters. Old mountain men called that eerie silence the held breath, the brief, ominous lull before the plains exhaled pure violence. It was during this atmospheric lull that Dr. Sean O'Connor arrived in the Black Ridge Valley. Dr. O'Connor was 60 years old, an Irish country physician with silver hair, a weathered face, and a pair of worn leather bags filled with diphtheria antitoxin and pneumonia tinctures. He had been traveling toward the northern logging camps when the rear iron rim of his light buggy snapped on a frozen rut half a mile from Thomas Vance's claim. Unable to continue, the old doctor was forced to seek shelter at the rough cabin of Jedediah Stone, the veteran trapper who had questioned Thomas's stone walls months earlier. "You picked a dark night to break a wheel, Doctor," Jedediah said, looking out toward the northern ridge where the sky had turned a terrifying bruised violet. "The glass in town dropped lower than anyone's ever seen it. Something terrible is coming down that gorge." In town, Mayor Ephraim Sterling paid little attention to the falling barometer. He was hosting an early winter gathering inside his 3-story oak mansion, boasting to local merchants that his iron-braced beams and 4 brick fireplaces made his home the safest fortress in the Wyoming territory. Then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the plains exhaled. It did not begin as an ordinary snowfall. It arrived as an Arctic funnel blizzard, a rare, devastating microburst whiteout where a dense mass of sub-zero air was forced through the narrow jaws of Black Ridge Gorge at 80 miles an hour. Within 30 minutes, the temperature plunged 40 degrees, dropping to 35 below zero. Snow did not fall from the sky. It was whipped horizontal, a blinding, razor-sharp wall of ice crystals that erased every landmark, fence line, and wagon trail in the valley. Down in town, the sheer physical force of the gale struck Mayor Sterling's 3-story mansion first. Sterling's home had been built according to traditional architectural pride, tall, flat, vertical oak walls rising 30 feet into the air. But flat walls created immense aerodynamic drag. When the 80-mile-an-hour gale slammed into the front of the mansion, the air could not slide past. Millions of pounds of atmospheric pressure piled up against the flat timber face, creating an immense wedge of trapped force. Unable to move sideways, the compressed gale surged violently upward over the eaves. This rapid upward rush created a powerful negative pressure zone, a massive suction vacuum, directly over the flat, steel-braced roof. At 6 o'clock that evening, a terrifying sound echoed through the blinding whiteout, a metallic screech like tearing iron, followed by a thunderous, splintering roar. The immense uplift vacuum created by the flat walls literally ripped the entire 3rd story and roof off Sterling's mansion. Iron cross-bracing sheared through frozen oak like paper. Heavy timber trusses were hurled into the dark, and hundreds of tons of snow and ice plunged directly into the living quarters below. The 4 brick chimneys collapsed inward, crushing the iron stoves, burying the firewood supply, and leaving Sterling, his family, and his guests completely exposed to the 35 below Arctic storm. 300 yards away at the mouth of the gorge, the same 80-mile-an-hour gale slammed into Thomas Vance's homestead. It struck the apex of the 45-degree V-shaped granite deflector walls first. Instead of building up destructive drag pressure against a flat surface, the angled stone chutes accepted the gale. The narrowing channels compressed the Arctic air, forcing it to accelerate through the granite troughs at over 100 miles an hour, sweeping harmlessly past both sides of the cabin. And then, the Venturi principle took effect exactly as Thomas had calculated. Because the gale was accelerating at violent speed through the stone channels on either side of the home, it created a stable, low-pressure vacuum envelope directly over the cabin roof. The air over the house remained completely still. The blinding snow hurled down from the gorge was caught in the high-speed lateral jets and vaulted straight over the cabin in a magnificent high arc, dumping hundreds of yards away into the deep ravine behind the pasture. Inside the cabin, the experience was almost surreal. While 80-mile-an-hour winds screamed through the granite chutes outside with the roar of a jet engine, the air inside Thomas's living room remained undisturbed. The flame of the kerosene lamp on the table did not flicker once. The brass thermometer hanging beside the hearth read a steady, unwavering 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Old Rusty lay stretched out comfortably on his rug near the hearth, his copper coat glowing in the warm stove light. Caleb sat beside him, quietly feeding a single pine knot into the cast-iron stove every 3 hours. Looking through the small, thick glass of the northern window, Thomas could see the hurricane of white snow racing past his stone deflectors, completely unable to touch his home. The yard inside the V-shaped chute remained remarkably clear, shielded by the invisible shield of low pressure his geometry had created. Half a mile away, huddled inside Jedediah Stone's drafty, snow-choked cabin, Dr. Sean O'Connor wiped the frost from a small window pane and looked out into the screaming white void. Jedediah's roof was groaning under immense drift weight. The fireplace was smoking heavily from backdrafts, and the room had fallen to 15 degrees above zero. But as Dr. O'Connor looked toward the mouth of the gorge, he saw something through the storm that made his jaw drop in disbelief. Through the blinding curtain of snow, high on the bench where the wind was fiercest, a single, straight ribbon of gray smoke was rising from Thomas Vance's chimney. It did not bend, it did not scatter. It rose straight upward into the storm, as if protected by an invisible glass cylinder. "Look at that, Jedediah," Dr. O'Connor whispered, pointing a trembling finger through the frost. "That man isn't surviving the storm. He's carved a pocket of peace right out of the middle of it." Jedediah Stone walked to the window, stared at the unbent smoke rising into the hurricane, and slowly lowered his head in silence. The trapper had spent 20 years fighting mountain weather with flat timber walls and sheer stubbornness. But standing there in his freezing room, he finally realized that the widower had tapped into a truth higher than mountain lore. By the third night of the Arctic whiteout, Black Ridge Valley had ceased to exist as a human settlement. The blizzard had simply erased it from the surface of the earth. Gales exceeding 80 miles an hour lashed down from the mountain passes, whipping 5-foot snowfalls into massive, solid drifts that buried fences, barns, and wagon trails 10 feet deep. The temperature had plunged to a deadly 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, exposed skin froze solid in less than 60 seconds. Breath turned to ice before it cleared a man's lips, and the cold bit so deep into timber that log cabins groaned and split like dry bones under hydraulic pressure. In the valley below, the illusion of frontier wealth had completely shattered. Inside Mayor Ephraim Sterling's ruined mansion, the lower floor had become a freezing ice cave. The drag vacuum created by his flat oak walls had ripped away his roof and upper stories days ago. Sterling, his family, and his remaining mill hands were huddled together under wet wool blankets in a corner of the ground floor. His grand stoves stood cold and empty, their chimneys clogged with ice. They had burned his dining chairs, his oak tables, and his bank ledgers, but the cold air poured in faster than the fires could warm it. By midnight on the third day, the temperature inside Sterling's parlor had fallen to 25 degrees below zero. Ice hung thick from his wallpaper. His remaining coal oil had turned to thick, unburnable jelly, and Sterling himself sat curled in the dirt, his hands blackening with frostbite, listening to his men weep from the excruciating pain of hypothermia. Half a mile away, inside Jedediah Stone's rough shelter, conditions were equally dire. The roof was sagging dangerously under 7 feet of drifted snow, and the temperature inside had fallen below zero. Dr. Sean O'Connor examined Jedediah's frostbitten fingers under the dim light of a dying tallow candle, then looked around at the 5 shivering men trapped in the room. He knew with absolute professional clarity that if they remained in that cabin until sunrise, none of them would ever wake up. Dr. O'Connor walked to the frost-coated window and looked up toward the bench at the mouth of the gorge. Through the blinding whiteout, he could still see that single, unbent wisp of gray smoke rising straight into the sub-zero sky from Thomas Vance's chimney. "We move now," Dr. O'Connor said, his voice firm and unyielding as he wrapped his leather medicine bags around his chest. "We crawl for that bench on the hill, or we freeze in our boots right here." Desperation gave the men strength they did not know they possessed. Mayor Sterling, Jedediah Stone, Dr. O'Connor, and 3 farmhands stepped out into the blinding 40-below tempest. They could not walk upright, the wind was too violent. They dropped to their hands and knees, crawling through 5 feet of powdery snow, following the incline of the hill toward the single chimney throwing warm smoke into the night. It was a journey measured in agony. Sterling's bare hands bled as he clutched frozen snow crusts. His mink-lined coat was torn to shreds, and his face was a chalk-white mask of advanced frostbite. For nearly an hour, the men crawled through the white void, blind, gasping, near death. And then, suddenly, they crossed an invisible boundary. As Sterling dragged himself over the crest of the bench, the howling violence of the gale vanished. The screaming wind that had been tearing at his clothes suddenly shot upward, passing 50 feet over his head in a loud, rushing roar. He found himself kneeling in a quiet, still basin of air. The snow on the ground was barely 3 inches deep. Before him stood Thomas Vance's timber cabin, completely unharmed, its windows glowing with a warm, golden oil lamp light. Sterling stumbled to his feet on trembling legs, staggered up to the front door, and slammed his frostbitten, bleeding hands against the heavy oak timber. "Thomas!" Sterling sobbed, his voice a pathetic, rasping squeak through frozen lips. "For God's sake! Thomas, help us!" Inside the cabin, Rusty's ears shot upright. The Irish setter stood up from his rug, letting out a low, alert bark. Caleb looked up from his slate, his eyes wide. Thomas did not hurry. He picked up his double-barrel hunting rifle from the corner, checked the brass caps under both hammers, and draped a wool shawl over his shoulders. He walked to the door, lifted the heavy oak security bar from its iron brackets, and opened the door 6 inches into the night. The warm, 65-degree air from inside the room spilled out into the cold like a golden wave. Kneeling in the shallow snow on his threshold was Mayor Ephraim Sterling, stripped of every shred of his former arrogance. Behind him, Dr. O'Connor and Jedediah Stone were dragging 2 semi-conscious farmhands into the quiet zone beneath the stone chutes. "Mercy, Thomas," Sterling wept, holding up his bleeding, frost-blackened hands in open supplication. "Let us in! We're freezing to death!" Thomas stood on his dry, warm threshold, holding his rifle in the crook of his arm, looking down at the man who had called his work a madman's grave, who had tried to drive him from his land, and whose saboteurs had tried to destroy his stone walls weeks earlier. He did not raise the rifle, nor did he step back to let them rush inside. "You called this stone ditch a madman's grave, Sterling," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the quiet night air with absolute, immovable clarity. "You brought your carriage to my fence to tell me I was digging my own burial trench, and you sent your men to smash my walls and steal my stone." Sterling wept, hot tears freezing into icy beads on his cheeks. "I was wrong. God help me, Vance, I was wrong. I'll pay for your wagon. I'll pay for the stone. I'll pay whatever you ask. Just don't leave us out here in the dark." Thomas reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a flat cedar shingle, a small vial of ink he had kept warm near his body, and a steel-nibbed pen. He laid the cedar shingle across Sterling's bleeding knees and pressed the pen into his stiff, numb fingers. "Sign a full confession and pledge of compensation for the broken wagon and stolen stone, Sterling," Thomas commanded softly. "Acknowledge right now, on the ice, that flat walls failed and stone chutes held." Sterling did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. With trembling, frostbitten fingers, he scribbled his signature across the wooden shingle, dropping the pen into the snow the moment the last letter was finished. Thomas picked up the shingle, checked the signature under his lantern light, and slipped it into his pocket. Then he lowered his rifle, stepped back from the threshold, and opened his door wide to the freezing men. "Caleb?" Thomas called out quietly over his shoulder as he helped Dr. O'Connor haul the semi-conscious farmhands across the doorway. "Put the big kettle on the stove and fetch the dry wool blankets. We have guests." The Arctic funnel blizzard finally broke on the morning of December 9th. When the morning sun broke over the high granite peaks for the first time in 5 days, it revealed a Black Ridge Valley that had been entirely rewritten by the storm. The sky was a pale, blinding blue, the air was deathly still, and the valley floor lay buried beneath 6 feet of pristine, wind-sculpted snow, drifting as high as 12 feet against the timber stands. Down in the basin, the price of architectural arrogance was written across the landscape. More than 80% of the flat-walled timber homes had suffered catastrophic damage. Roofs had been ripped away by drag vacuums, barns had collapsed under drift weight, and Mayor Ephraim Sterling's grand 3-story oak mansion existed only as a splintered, snow-filled shell resting in a mound of debris. Yet high on the bench at the mouth of the gorge, Thomas Vance's homestead stood completely untouched. Inside the cabin, 8 people woke to the warm, golden morning light streaming through the clean window panes. Mayor Sterling, Dr. O'Connor, Jedediah Stone, and their farmhands gathered around the timber table, drinking hot coffee and eating corn cakes prepared by Thomas and young Caleb. None of them retained the arrogance they had carried months earlier. Their frostbitten skin was dressed with pine salve provided by Dr. O'Connor. Their numb fingers were wrapped in clean wool, and their eyes carried the quiet, humbled look of men who had stared into the jaw of winter and survived only by another's wisdom. Dr. Sean O'Connor stepped outside shortly after sunrise, his boots crunching softly in the shallow snow within the V-shaped chute. He walked along the inner face of the granite deflector wall, examining the 45-degree angles, the tightly woven juniper brush, and the stone-lined exit channels. Farther out, beyond the stone chutes, the snow was piled 15 feet deep in the ravine where the Venturi acceleration had hurled it. But here, inside the deflector envelope, the yard remained clear, and the modest cabin stood dry and warm beneath the mountain sun. Dr. O'Connor pulled a leather-bound journal from his coat pocket, opened to a fresh page, and began writing in neat, precise script. Man does not defeat the mountain storm by standing against it with flat walls. He survives by understanding its motion, yielding to its speed, and carving a pocket of peace from its own momentum. Jedediah Stone walked up behind the doctor, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets. The veteran trapper looked at the stone chutes, then at Thomas Vance, who was unbarring the barn door to feed his oxen. Jedediah walked over to Thomas and extended a rough, calloused hand. "I spent 20 years believing flat timber and heavy logs could beat a Wyoming gale, Thomas," Jedediah said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of his former skepticism. "I was a fool. You didn't fight the storm, you taught it where to go." Thomas looked at the old trapper, took his hand, and gave it a firm, quiet shake. "The mountain taught us both, Jedediah. I just put its lesson into stone." Later that afternoon, Mayor Ephraim Sterling left the Vance claim on a rescue sled brought up by search parties from town. His hands were wrapped in thick white linen bandages, his face scarred by frostbite. He honored the cedar shingle he had signed on Thomas's threshold, paying full gold coin compensation for the wrecked wagon and stolen stone. Sterling never rebuilt his 3-story oak mansion. 2 years later, he sold his sawmill interests and moved back east, his arrogance forever humbled by the night he crawled through the snow. When spring finally returned to Black Ridge Valley in April of 1883, the snow melted from the high gorge, and Black Creek ran clear and swift once more. The valley did not return to its old ways. When the new settlers arrived that summer to rebuild their ruined claims, they did not build tall, flat timber walls. Instead, they rode their wagons up the long hill to Thomas Vance's homestead. They came not to mock, but to learn. They stood on his bench with transit levels, measuring rods, and notebooks, asking about 45-degree friction angles, Venturi acceleration, and low-pressure vacuums. Thomas and Caleb turned no one away. Together, father and son taught every builder in the basin how to align deflector walls with the wind gaps, how to lock river boulders into cantilevered arches, and how to weave juniper brush to create airtight channels. Across the Wyoming Territory, the V-shaped stone and brush deflectors became standard winter construction for mountain homesteads, recorded in territorial survey maps and frontier history under a permanent name, the Vance Chutes. Years passed across the high country. Caleb Vance grew into a brilliant geological surveyor, following his father's footsteps across the Continental Divide, mapping mountain passes and teaching future generations how to build in harmony with nature. Old Rusty lived out his final years sleeping peacefully in the warm, windless yard inside the granite chutes he had helped guard through the great whiteout. The name Madman's Stone Ditch vanished from local speech forever, remembered only as a shameful relic of the town's former ignorance. The story of Thomas Vance was never simply about river boulders, juniper brush, or sub-zero blizzards. It stood as an enduring testament to a timeless frontier truth, that nature never surrenders to human pride, and the strongest protection is not always the one that looks the heaviest. Sometimes, wisdom arrives disguised as a pile of river rocks and a quiet man who knows how to listen to the wind. And when the great Arctic storm comes to deliver its final judgment, the only witness whose opinion truly matters is the season itself.